Hello, my name is Bob Koch, and I'm an extension entomologist at the University of Minnesota. Today I'm going to provide you some updates on our research related to the use of remote sensing for the soybean aphid. And in particular, can we use some of these remote sensing technologies to improve the efficiency of our scouting for this pest? So let's just take a step back and review the current recommendations for management of soybean aphid. We recommend getting into soybean fields and estimating the abundance or the number of aphids on multiple plants spread throughout that field. And then based on that average number of aphids per plant, we make a decision if we should treat that field or not. And that critical density, the economic threshold for soybean aphid, is 250 aphids per plant. That's the point at which we should begin lining up an insecticide application to knock down that infestation before it reaches economically damaging levels. And then that's when done by coming in with what would hopefully be an effective application of an insecticide. However, we know this method of scouting is time intensive and costly, traversing large fields, estimating high numbers of aphids, and it doesn't provide a complete picture of what's going on in the field. We're only inspecting plants in a small subset of areas from throughout that whole field. And because of this time-intensive, costly nature, we know farmers are looking for something more efficient. So what we're trying to address is to see if we can use remote sensing tools to advance or improve soybean aphid scouting. We need to provide a little bit of foundational information for understanding remote sensing. And the remote sensing that we're doing depends on the sun's energy. This solar energy is made up of multiple different wavelengths of energy that span the electromagnetic spectrum. Here you can see it ranging from ultraviolet through the visible wavelengths, blue, green, red, and into the near infrared. So when the sun's energy comes down to the Earth's surface and hits plant material, which we're representing here with these green rectangles, some of that energy is reflected back up into the sky. Some of it's absorbed by the leaves for photosynthesis. Some of that energy passes through the leaf or is transmitted through the leaf. And for remote sensing purposes, what we're interested in is the energy that's reflected back up into the sky. And we can intercept some of that energy and measure it with different kinds of sensors. And the idea is these sensors can measure how much energy is being reflected at different wavelengths along that electromagnetic spectrum. And we know, based on previous research, that different changes within the plant can affect how that energy is being reflected. And these changes could be abiotic stressors like drought stress, or different pests that could affect the pigments in the leaves, the internal leaf structure, how those cells are configured, water content of the leaves, and even the orientation and distribution of leaves on those plants. So changes to any one of those factors can affect how the energy is reflected, and we oftentimes can detect those changes through these remote sensing tools. Here's a cartoon diagram showing some differences between healthy plant vegetation and unhealthy vegetation. Across the bottom of the graph, we've got different wavelengths of energy, and we see the amount of reflectance measured at each wavelength. So if you look more closely, we see in the near infrared wavelengths that healthy vegetation has higher levels of reflectance than unhealthy vegetation. However, if we look into the red wavelengths, we see that unhealthy vegetation has higher levels of reflectance than the healthy vegetation. So our first research question was, does the soybean aphid affect the spectral reflectance of soybean plants? One of my previous students, Tavez Alves, performed this research at Rosemont, Minnesota in 2013 and 2014. He used cages placed over soybean plots to manipulate the soybean aphid densities. Some of the cages were infested with aphids, some were uninfested. We came back on a weekly basis through the growing season and estimated the number of aphids per plant and took these spectral reflectance measurements. from that, we were able to document that soybean aphid did indeed affect the spectral reflectance of the soybean canopy. Across the bottom of this graph and some of the other graphs in this presentation, you'll see cumulative aphid days, and that's that measure of how soybean aphid pressure accumulates on plants over time, much like how growing degree days accumulate over the season. On the side of the graph, we've got NDVI, and that's a mathematical combination of reflectance from a near infrared wavelength and a red wavelength. And what we see is that as cumulative aphid days increased, NDVI measures decreased. And in 2014, we see a very similar pattern, again, documenting that these handheld sensors, so a sensor that you hold in your hand just above the soybean canopy, maybe 2 or 3 feet above, we can detect the stress caused by soybean aphids from this kind of an approach. However, we also wanted to know, can we detect this aphid-induced stress from an aerial platform like a drone? So another student of mine, Zach Marston, he performed some research at Rosemont, Minnesota, and down in Kanawha, Iowa in 2017 and 2018, again using cages. These cages were slightly larger than the previous cages that we used. And again, some cages infested with aphids, some were uninfested. We came back throughout the season to assess aphid populations on the plants and to get the spectral measures. But instead of using a handheld sensor, we used a sensor that was suspended from a drone. In the picture on the right, you can see one of the images that we collected from the drone of the research plots. And this particular sensor included a red, green, blue sensor, a narrowband red sensor, narrowband near infrared, and a broadband near infrared. And much like the previous research, we were able to again document that soybean aphid had an impact on reflectance of the soybean canopy. In this case, on the side of the graphs, we've got the measure of reflectance in the near infrared. And in the top 2 graphs, which are from Rosemont in 2017, the middle 2 graphs from Rosemont in 2018, we see that as the soybean aphid pressure, cumulative aphid days increased, the reflectance measured in the near infrared decreased. And for 2018 in Kanawha, shown in those bottom 2 graphs, the first date, we did not see a decrease in near infrared, and that's because there were relatively few aphids on the plants at that time. But by the time we got to that second sample date, we saw a significant decrease again in the near infrared reflectance. So we've been able to show that from a handheld sensor on the ground or from a drone-based sensor flying over the field, we can detect the stress that soybean aphids are causing to soybean plants. The next question we had is, can we use this spectral reflectance data to classify soybean aphid infestations as being above or below the treatment threshold? Remember, for soybean aphids, that treatment threshold is 250 aphids per plant, the point at which we're supposed to start lining up that insecticide application. And I don't have time to get into the details of this work. What I want to point out to you is that based on machine learning and specific linear support vector machine learning, our optimized model, the one in the middle column, outlined with the green rectangle, that model included reflectance measures from 780 nanometers and 1010 nanometers. With those data, we were able to accurately classify soybean aphid infestations at a level of 89% accuracy as being above or below that threshold. And this is really promising for the perspective of being able to use drone-based remote sensing data to make decisions for management of soybean aphid infestations. However, we still have a lot of other things to learn about the spectral reflectance of soybean canopies, interactions with other pests, other stressors. And one of the questions we had that we're trying to address now is, what if we have other pests in the field with soybean aphid? In particular, what if this other new invasive pest, the Japanese beetle, is in the field? This pest feeds differently than the soybean aphid. This one actually chews holes into the leaves rather than sucking the sap. Treatment thresholds for the Japanese beetle are 30% defoliation before the soybean plants flower and 20% defoliation after flowering. So does this feeding injury by the Japanese beetle affect our ability to detect soybean aphid stress on soybean? We're in the middle of this project. We conducted research in 2019 and 2020, and we're planning to do it again this next summer. We've been doing research at St. Paul and at Rochester. And at one location, we use cages, again, to manipulate the pest populations. And at Rochester, we've been using insecticides. But at both sites, we essentially have plots with no pests, plots with just aphids, plots with just Japanese beetles, and then plots with aphids and Japanese beetles. More recently, this last summer, we also added an artificial defoliation treatment. We haven't fully analyzed these data, but some of the preliminary results are indicating that the more typical levels of defoliation caused by Japanese beetle, right around 5% defoliation, can sometimes cause an increase in reflectance in the red wavelengths, but we're not seeing an impact to reflectance in the near infrared. And this is really promising for remote sensing for soybean aphid, because we're seeing the biggest impacts of soybean aphid on those near infrared wavelengths, which are not being affected by the Japanese beetle, at least based on these preliminary analyses. However, our artificial defoliation treatments, which reached levels of up to 33% defoliation, those did indeed cause changes in the near infrared reflectance. So that heavy of injury to the plants, that heavy of defoliation up to 33%, seems like it could affect our ability to use remote sensing to scout for soybean aphid. So in summary, I just want to point out again that this aphid-induced stress can be detected from ground-based sensors and drone-based sensors. We were able to accurately classify soybean aphid infestations as being above or below the treatment threshold, which again is promising when we're starting to think about trying to utilize remote sensing for deciding to treat or not treat soybean fields. We've got a lot of different ongoing work. Some of our research is looking at other stressors, like not only the Japanese beetle, but also different diseases in soybean. We're looking at economic aspects of using drone-based remote sensing versus traditional scouting methods. And we just received funding to start looking at remote sensing from a satellite-based platform. So instead of having these sensors suspended from drones flying over the fields, can we utilize the sensors that are built into satellites orbiting the Earth to detect soybean aphid stress or soybean aphid injury on a much broader, even regional scale? So again, the bottom line goal is, can we improve the efficiency of soybean aphid scouting from trudging through fields, counting aphids on plants, to flying a drone or satellite over fields and getting the reflectance information and using that to make decisions? This has been a very large overall collaborative project with multiple departments from the University of Minnesota, colleagues from Iowa State University, and we're grateful to numerous funding sources, including our support for the current project looking at the soybean aphid and Japanese beetle. The support there is coming from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial and Plant Pests Center. With that, I'd like to thank you for participating in this presentation. I've got my email address here if you have any questions, and I'd like to point out to you the Minnesota Crop News blog, which is one of the outlets through which we disseminate our research-based information related to all aspects of crop production. Thank you.